Well, hello everybody, Susan Gillis here. I am the author of 7 books on local history, working on number 8. So Pat has asked me to speak with you all about researching, writing, doing, publishing local history. Next slide. So most of my books have been with Arcadia Publishing. You may be familiar with Arcadia. They do a lot of those photographic histories, but they also do narrative histories. For example, Fort Lauderdale is a narrative history. And I work with Turner Publishing. The picture at the top, Historic Photos of Fort Lauderdale, that was for Turner. The new book, which is in the research stage, who knows? We're allowing ourselves plenty of time. Our centennial is not until 2029. Oh, wow. However, the city manager wanted you to get started on it. So next slide, please. In addition, I have worked with Pediment Publishing. Now, Pediment did these 2 handsome coffee table books on the left, Looking Back 1 and 2, for the Sun Sentinel. But the contributors were local historical societies from our 2 counties, which means Sue Gillis represented several historical societies in this book. So I got to work with their editor, who was absolutely charming, and they were very wonderful to work with. The History Press does more narrative histories, very local history oriented. They are now owned by Arcadia. And then there is my friends at Middle River Press that are in Oak Park, the Borishes, and they did a beautiful coffee table book on the history of the Lauderdale Yacht Club. And the Pioneer Cook in Southeast Florida, we did a reprint of a book we did in the 70s, and I just want to give a little plug for that. Half of it's a recipe book by the Boca Raton Historical Society, but it also has original primary resource accounts of life, everyday life of our early pioneers in the late 19th and 20th century. So you can learn how to make turkey egg pancakes, for instance, and other important tips. Okay, next slide. So this slide is just to remind me, so ignore it. Plus, I've written countless articles, what I call blurbs. My boss will say, Sue, you write so much better than I do. Will you write? Okay. And exhibits require a lot of writing and researching because you have captions, you have introductions, you have summaries, you have PR. My background is I am a museum curator by training, and I worked for Boca Raton Historical Society Museum for 19 years. I can't believe it. I was before with the Fort Lauderdale Historical Society, many of you remember that. And I have lived in Oakland Park for 29 years. And so over the past 5 years, I have volunteered for the Oakland Park Historical Archives, formerly the Historical Society. The Historical Archives are now under the stewardship of the library, which we have an independent library. And so over the past 5 years, I have assisted cataloging and digitizing that collection. We did that with a number of grants. And actually access those digital archives through FIU's digital library. Getting some background. Or is that me?
Somebody's in the kitchen.
All right. Gotta mute people. Sorry about that. Fort Lauderdale, Venice, America is actually a narrative history. It is sort of the successor to Checkered Sunshine. You all remember Checkered Sunshine? Published in the 60s. It was the first history of Fort Lauderdale book. And so I took on the task of updating that another 50 years. So it goes through the year 2000. and writing about the things I've learned that we have learned since that book was published to produce Fort Lauderdale, the Venice of America. I won a national award for that. So I'm very, very proud of that publication. Well, the point of that story is people ask me, how long did it take you to write that book? And the answer is 20 years. Because it took that long for me to feel comfortable with the comprehensive view of the history of an entire city from pre-Columbian times to the present. But I don't want to dissuade you. The more research, the better your product. That's the point of this story. And just because you, as a curator, I have an unfair advantage because of my years with these various agencies, I actually have an intimate knowledge of the history of 3 towns. Intimate knowledge, because my job is to collect, catalog, preserve, and make accessible to researchers in lectures, in exhibits, in publications, the history of those communities. So I have in the back of my brain the combined knowledge of hundreds of pioneers and longtime residents, which is something even a longtime resident doesn't have, even though I did not grow up in these communities. But again, I don't want to dissuade you because you too have your own personal experiences and you too can tackle the local history subject. Next slide. So here's some examples. And I've encouraged my friends and fellow curators to write about what they've been doing research on. And here's some examples. My friend Todd Bavo was my successor at Fort Lauderdale Historical Society. He just published a real fun book on lost restaurants of Fort Lauderdale. Cindy Thuma was a longtime sports writer for the Sun Sentinel, and she published Fort Lauderdale. What a great topic. And Sally Ling is a writer out of Deerfield. And way back in 2004 or something like that, she came to Boca Raton Historical because she was doing research for an article on the Boca Raton Army Airfield, which was a very large military installation during World War II, where they taught radar, which was still a top secret technology back then. Well, she found very quickly we had way too much stuff for an article. It was a book. And I encouraged her, and she did publish this book with History Press, and that was the beginning of a new, really, career for her because she's published many, many books on local history and also got into fiction. So kudos to Sally. My friend, I spelled Hollywood pretty funny. My friend Stacey Adams, I do know how to spell Hollywood, that's my hometown, is writing a book on the Hollywood Sportatorium. Do you all remember the Sportatorium in way out west? And it was a perfectly horrible venue, which wonderful rock and roll acts performed at. So Stacey's writing a book about that. And I know Fort Lauderdale published a little book called Businesses That Built Fort Lauderdale. Now, this is a great idea for Pompano because not only do you document that topic, but you, as a historical society, earn a lot of new corporate sponsors and donors and collections items. So next slide. Now, I want to beg you as a researcher to, from the get-go, cite your references. Even if your publisher, like Arcadia, does not allow footnotes, that doesn't mean you, as a personal researcher, should not keep track of your citations. Where did you get information? Even if it came out of your head, you need to write Sue Gillis, such and such a date, and this is where I'm writing it, okay? And why is that? It gives you street cred as a historian. It gives you legitimacy, and it keeps the future generations from reinventing the doggone wheel. That drives me crazy. People call me and I'll say, why didn't you call me? I've already done this, okay? You don't want them to go down the same path. That's silly. And when you have completed your publication or article or what have you, please share your research with your local historical society. I noticed Frank, is it Kavanaugh, did some Pompano history books with Arcadia. I think that's his name. He actually shared his research with the Broward County Historical Archives. Kudos to him. When I was the centennial historian for Fort Lauderdale Centennial back in 2011, and I took all my, of course I kept copy, but I took, I put as much stuff on portable hard drives as possible. I put all hard copy in a couple of bins, and I gave them to Fort Lauderdale Historical Society, so they didn't have to redo everything I did. So please do that. It can't hurt to read some professional articles by professional historians. The Florida Historical Quarterly is a good source for that. I think those are online. Now, we don't expect you to remember from high school how to do footnotes and bibliographies all the time, okay? So a book like the one on the left is very handy. You can probably download that as a PDF. For you journalism English majors, in the history department, at least in my day, we preferred the Chicago Manual style instead of the MLA style sheet and there's all kinds of style sheets. And Turabian is really the Chicago style. There are chapters and chapters dedicated to how you do footnotes, even on things like photographs, live performances, artwork, websites, Facebook, all of that, okay? So there is a method. You aren't supposed to memorize it. You're supposed to go into the book and figure out the proper citation form. In addition, let me tell you a little anecdote about myself. When I was in high school, I did a lot of research papers. So I go to college, and in Virginia, and we had a requirement. You had to have a course in writing a composition or pass a test, you know, exempt it with a test. So I was able to exempt it. So I felt very confident. Well, I had, one of my first courses was the material culture of colonial America. And material culture is antiques, objects, technology, as opposed to documents and things like that. My favorite subject, even today, my favorite subject. We had a wonderful professor, David Selby. He was actually worked for Colonial Williamsburg. This was in Williamsburg, Virginia, and had gotten all his degrees from Hyde. So, especially to a bunch of Virginians, he talked funny. It took us 2 months to figure out that bottle was spelled B-O-T-T-L-E, and a little commonwealth was a little commonwealth. But a lovely, lovely gentleman, and very amusing. So it came time to hand in papers, because I was I was a history and an anthropology major. I had papers all the time. So it comes time, and back in the old days, you had to go to the professor's office to hand in your paper, okay? Not like now. That's when we found out, number one, he had a secretary. Ooh, most of my professors did not have a secretary. Number two, not only was he the graduate dean of arts and sciences, but he was the editor of the William and Mary Quarterly, one of the most prestigious and oldest American history journals in the United States. William and Mary is the second oldest university in the United States. So we weren't intimidated. So I actually sat down and read Turabian, and you know what? I learned some stuff. So you might want to browse it as well. Now, a couple of fun notes from the history department. In the history department, we don't put an apostrophe when we do a date. Journalists and newspapers can do that all they want, but if you put an apostrophe in 1960s, the history department will know you did not get out of the history department alive. The other fun note is there is a difference between historic and historical, and if you don't use them a lot, historic means something is history, and historical means it's about history. So historical society collects historic objects. Okay, next slide. Okay, now I want to talk about the resources at your command as a local historian. I'm presuming you're going to be interested in Pompano, but this could apply wherever you're interested in. First of all, your own city clerk's office. My city clerk's office has wonderful scrapbooks of every single article on Oakland Park from 1980s up to the present. And over the Christmas holidays, I sat there and went through them. She could hear me snickering in the back office because Oakland Park had a very colorful political history in the 80s and 90s. I don't know if you all remember that. Quite fun. Your own historical society has wonderful files, maps, photographs, all sorts of information, probably oral histories. The Broward County Historical Archives is at Main Library, and it is back open again. Now, this used to be the Historical Commission. You all remember the commission. It was last housed at the beautiful West Side School. And unfortunately, the agency was really sunsetted about 10 years ago. It was an independent agency of the county. And the collections were turned over to the library. Well, unfortunately, at this time, apparently they lost or did away with the Miss Denise Cunningham, who was the last curator of the collections, files and catalog of the collection, which is a horrible crime against history. And Denise, I hope you're not listening to that. But that is not the fault of the current stewards of the collection. The young lady I deal with is perfectly charming. She is a relative newcomer to Florida, so she's not familiar with Pompano or Oakland Park history. She is now. But she will do her darndest to find information for you. You have to make an appointment. She's only with the Historical Archives 2 days a week. But there's some fabulous material in there. There are drawers of information on Pompano. They're labeled Pompano. Great photographs and wonderful oral histories, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The Fort Lauderdale Historical Society has a lot of material on Pompano, and Sue knows this because she cataloged it. Not only is it under files called Pompano, but for example, the airport would be under transportation aviation. Some landmark restaurants might be under businesses, restaurants, and wonderful photos. Historic prints, as well as the Jean Hyde collection, which I'm going to talk about in a couple of minutes, and also magnificent aerials from the 60s, the Bird's Eye collection, which have been digitized, and there's plenty of Pompano and North County material in there. Fabulous. There's fabulous Oakland Park stuff. The Florida Heritage Collection is the state archives and the State University archives. Digital collection, just type in Pompano, see what you get. Ditto with the Florida Photographic Archives. There are Pompano pictures in there. I looked it up the other night. And you can request a high resolution version of images if you need a high resolution for publication. And they're very reasonable, something like $10 a pop. Now, National Archives and Library of Congress probably aren't going to be any help in your local history research, but we found interviews with veterans of the Boca Raton Army Airfield in there. So what can I say? It's never know. Other local historical societies. It turns out that Eastern Oakland Park and Wilton Manors in the early 20th century was known as Collahatchee. And so that was sort of the rural area between Fort Lauderdale and Pompano. So we have this shared history. So I have worked with the Olms, who are Wilton Manor Historical Society volunteers, and we have been sharing our rather extensive research on Collahatchee and having a great deal of fun doing that. If you're researching archaeological sites or historic buildings, you want to check with your Pompano Preservation Board and also with the Broward County Preservation Board. Rick Ferrer is the liaison with the County Preservation Board. History Miami was founded in the 40s. I used to volunteer there when I was a kid. It is the Historical Association of Southern Florida, the largest history museum in the state, and certainly for many decades, the only historical society collecting all of South Florida history. Worth a look. They have 1 million photographs in the collection. I'm not kidding. Broward Legacy is a wonderful journal that was done by the Historical Commission. They are all online through FAU's digital library. And there is an index put together by my friend Pat Scott, who is a wonderful research historian. So you can download the index issue and find all sorts of wonderful material. Of course, newspapers.com, what a wonder that has been for for historical research. Now, let me talk about that. I'm very familiar with it. The Miami Herald is in there, the Fort Lauderdale News, and the South Florida Sun Sentinel. Unfortunately, the Pompano Sun Sentinel is not. The Fort Lauderdale Herald and the Fort Lauderdale Sentinel, which preceded the Fort Lauderdale News, are not. They're microfilm, but not digitized. The Miami News is also in there, but the predecessors to the Miami News are the Tropical Sun and the Miami Metropolis. Now, those were our first newspapers in South Florida. We don't count Key West as South Florida. Okay, Key West is way ahead of us. And unfortunately, that's the 1890s and first decade of the 20th century. Those are not digitized. Also missing in action are a lot of the issues of community news, the neighbors section. You remember the newspaper used to publish neighborhood sections that came. There were newspapers that were in the format of a magazine. And so some of those have been digitized, but some not. And the reason I found that out is looking through those scrapbooks I told you about. That's hard copy of the paper. And what I did was I would take down the title of the article and the date and the newspaper and go home and get on newspapers.com to access the article so I could download a digital copy. And that's when I found out, hey, I can't find this, I can't find this. And I know it was printed in the paper because I'm looking at it. So I deduced it was actually the community news sections that, in other words, they did not manage to either microfilm them or scan them, which is too bad because that's where our really good stuff from our different municipalities is, okay? Nonetheless, you're going to find tons of information on Pompano Beach in newspapers.com, tons. Ancestry is good if you're trying to figure out who's related to who. And last but not least, I want to talk about oral histories. First of all, Fort Lauderdale Historical has like 200 oral histories. Broward County has 300. They are not very well cataloged. And so what they say is the name of the interviewee. What I did was I have an Excel database of my Oakland Park Pioneer Day pioneers, of which I am one, by the way. I thought that was hilarious. Anyway, thank you, Oakland Park. And I sat down with all the boxes of cassette tapes at Broward County Historical Archives and looked through every one to see if any of them were my Oakland Park pioneers. And you could do the same with Pompano. And the thing is, a lot of those tapes, those people are no longer with us. So that's really important information. Okay, next slide. Okay, forgive me, but I'm going to whine on and on about oral history because I want to share with you lessons I have learned personally from my own mistakes, okay? I wasn't actually trained to do oral histories, even in the history department. We do that now, but anyway, let me share with you some really important tips. Oral histories are, to me, not the ideal source of information. They're not, because people's memories aren't that great. I mean, they change with time, and we all hear a lot of legends, not necessarily hard truth. So they're not really a good source for dates and places and even people, usually. But sometimes that is absolutely your only source of information. And oral histories bring texture and color to the past. So you could read about the Depression in the paper and hard times, but you really need to ask a person, okay, you were a kid during the Depression. What did you do for fun in Pompano or Oakland Park during the Depression? That's something that these other sources are not going to answer for you. They give humanity to your history. You want to make it interesting and relatable to your readers. History doesn't have to be boring and staid. It can be humanistic, and of interest and relatable to people. So here's some tips. First of all, make sure your recording device is on and it's working. I've been there, done that, okay? Make sure you have plenty of juice, batteries, or what have you. Do a little test. If there's a separate microphone, make sure it also is switched on. Now, just a hint, If you're using a video recorder, you might want to invest in a digital voice recorder as well, because it can be easier to transcribe from the audio file than the video file. Just besides, it's good to have backup. Okay. Clearly enunciate your name, the name of your subject, the date of the interview, and the place the interview is being held. I can't tell you how many tapes I've gone to transcribe, and I don't even know who the people are. And ask your interviewee to spell their doggone name. I interviewed Carol Stevens of Oakland Park today. It's Carylstevens. It could have been Stephatens, but I had her spell her name. Have a list of general questions. You can chat with the person a little before you turn on the tape. Make them more comfortable. Do not talk at the same time. When you're transcribing tapes, it's gobbledygook. You can't distinguish the two voices, so you just lost all that information. What you might do is have a hand signal. Now, usually the interview, these days, I like to just film the interviewee, and I'm off camera. Okay, nobody needs to see me. But what I do is I'll say, okay, if I hold my hand up like this, that means you should pause and let me ask a clarification question. So that's just an easy idea. On a similar note, it's not a good idea to interview more than one person at a time because they talk at each other. Watch out for background noise. The recorder doesn't distinguish, and when you're hearing it, you know, it all flattens it out. It's like when you have a hearing aid. It's very hard to distinguish when you're not in the room between voices and noises. Turn off your doggone cell phone. Take that landline off the hook. Kick the cats, the dogs, and the children out the back door. Because, oh my gosh, I've just been transcribing the tape where there's little kids playing in the foreground. Oh, it's horrible. Don't let the subject talk on and on, like I'm doing now. It's better because they will, and they'll get all off subject. You're there to guide the person, not to tell them what to say, but to keep them sort of on a certain path, all right? And you want to think in advance, and it depends on your interviewee. You need to know, the more you know about them before you interview them, the better the interview will be. You need to know what kind of questions to ask them. Obviously, people get off the subject a bit, but try and veer them back to the conversation. Interviews are most successful when they have a really good focus, like the storm of 26, World War II in Broward County, something like that. Tell us about your business. Who was the competition? Why did you come here? Next slide. It's always helpful to have a prop, an old photo, a newspaper, a uniform, and this stimulates people's memory. Always, always have your subject sign and date a release form. This is a copyright release. You can download sample forms, just Google oral history release form or something, and you'll get a sample. No public library and no educational institution will publish your interview if you don't have a release. That's to cover their rear end. You just have to have that. And it's very hard to do 40 years after the fact, like we've had to try to do in Boca Raton, where all our interviewees are deceased now. Very hard. Do try and take a few notes while you're during the interview. This will expedite cataloging because it may be 50 years, and yes, I speak from experience, before you get around to transcribing those tapes.
Yes.
And you want them to be useful. So if you have a few notes, here's what we talked about, okay? That is so much more helpful and helps you catalog and let somebody else use that hard work that the two of you did. You might have a pioneer biography form. Pompano probably has one. Ask them to print, please, their name and where they live and their contact information. Again, that helps with the catalog. Simple sample questions. Why did you come to Oakland Park? How long have you been here? What did you do before air conditioning, before pest control, who are your competitors? There's many, many questions you can answer. Okay, next. Illustrations. A lot of historians, particularly professionals, think of this as secondary to their publication. But For local historians, this is a very important part of your research. Photographs and images are as much documents as any article, professional, newspaper article, what have you. They are documentation. First of all, don't believe everything that's on the back of the picture because sometimes it's wrong because people's memories are fallible, just like I mentioned before. Don't forget to cite your photograph just like you would any other source. All right, next. Okay, now I talked about the Gene Hyde collection. I want to talk about it in a minute. I actually wrote a book called The Broward County, the Photography of Gene Hyde. And Mr. Hyde was a longtime professional photographer. He came in the 30s, graduated from Fort Lauderdale High. And in his day, he was the photographer for the Broward edition of the Herald, the AP photographer, and the UPI photographer. So he was a documentarian big time, particularly in the 50s and 60s and early 70s. Plus, he did the usual things that photographers do. Now, when I did my book about him, it was just after he passed, I wanted to show the incredible breadth of his collection. All 200,000 images are professional images. So, I mean, where do you start? Well, fortunately, he has an index. There is an index in his collection. And I knew in addition to everyday scenes of everyday life and special scenes of special occasions, I wanted to include as many municipalities as he had photographed in Broward County. So I indeed have looked at every single Pompano picture in Gene's collection. And let's say there's 50 jobs, not 50 photographs. Each job one assignment might be Pompano High, and another assignment is Storyland, and there would be 10 or 20 or 50 pictures in each job. So there's a lot of images. Here are some I actually used in my book. Real Pompano bean pickers from 1953, a wonderful picture. Pompano High, when it was new. In 1958, we've got the cheerleaders doing backflips. And Storyland in 1955. Sue went to Storyland, probably just before it closed. I remember Storyland. Next slide. Here's two of my favorite pics. This is the Pinewood Heights public housing project in 1950. It's all shiny and new. And that wonderful picture of this 50s kitchen with a cute little kid getting water out of this 1950s classic pitcher. I just love these images. Next. So I tell a couple of funny stories on myself about postcards. Now, the original, this is color, so forgive me, I only had access to a black and white, so it's a color postcard. So postcards are a real important source of color images in an otherwise black and white world, as you might imagine. So this postcard is in the collection of the Fort Lauderdale Historical Society, and I actually wrote a book called Fort Lauderdale and Vintage Postcards, and they had like 1,000 postcards. In the Fort Lauderdale collection, it says a palm-shaded residence street, Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Well, how about that? Because in the Hollywood postcard book, it says Hollywood, Florida, Harrison Street looking west. It's the same doggone scene. And I kept wondering why I couldn't quite put my finger on what street was that. Is that real? This isn't that. Well, guess what? I'm not sure it's on Harrison Street either. So obviously this postcard company took this photo and sold it to whoever in Florida wanted to use it. And now I can't trust either information unless I could verify that's Harrison Street. And of course, this was taken a long time ago. It may not look like this anymore. Next slide. Okay, ditto. Similarly, this postcard is Port Everglades. And on the back, it was sent, and the cancellation date is like 1955, something like that. Well, guess what? That's not the date of the picture, because the Fort Lauderdale Historical Society not only owns the postcard, but that's actually an original photo that it's based on, it was taken in right after the end of the war, so December 45 or something. I don't quite remember, but it was definitely, not 1955. And that's an escort carrier docked at Port Everglades, and that's a Navy section base in the background. So it is late World War II, not 1955. And you know that every mom and pop motel and every restaurant in town when they were new, they went out and had a professional photographer take a nice picture, and they had a postcard made, and they used the same postcard for the next 50 years. I know the Boca Raton Resort and Club did that, and they could easily afford a new postcard every year. And the reason I know that is because the Boca Raton Historical Society Museum have 3,000 pictures of the Boca Raton Resort, which opened in 1926, and Sue Gillis cataloged every single one of those. And they used the same aerial view in the 1930s as in the 40s, because in the 40s, they say Shine Hotels on the back, and Mr. Shine bought the hotel in 1944. But I said, wait a minute, this is the same picture from 1933. Okay, so let that be a warning to you. Next slide. Okay, similarly, this is really fun. So I love postcards and pictures that say Florida. You know, we are we're a beach town, right? So bathing duties and fishing and boating and stuff like that, and the beach. Well, once again, what does it say? Duty on the beach at Hollywood, Florida. Well, guess what? The Fort Lauderdale version says Fort Lauderdale. And not only that, if you look behind the caption at the top, there's an isthmus of land, an island. I don't think this is anywhere I recognize in South Florida. I grew up in Dade County. That beach ain't right. I'm not even sure that's Florida. Now, there is a photographer who could probably track it down. But you know, this company had this nice bathing beauty picture, and they just sold it to every town on the east coast of Florida, probably. So if you want to be accurate, there you go. Okay, next. Now, let's talk about illustrations and proper scanning techniques. It's better to do this as you're going along, okay? It's preferable if you can scan while you're, because you may say, okay, Mrs. So-and-so had great pictures, but now I can't get a hold of her, right? So it's ideal if you can scan when you're talking to people and finding collections as you go along. Now, various publishers have their own standards for scans. They'll tell you what that is up front. Arcadia, for instance, it has to be a certain quality. It has to be what we call high resolution. The kind you download from Facebook or what looks good on your screen is not going to cut it in print format. So you can't go wrong if you use what we call archival standards for digitization. Now, how do you find what that is? Well, I recommend you go to www.floridamemory.com. It's a state site. And over on the right, it has a digitization guide that is, to me, the easiest to read of any such digitization guide. Basically, most images say postcard size or larger. If you scan them 600 DPI, TIFF format, not JPEG, an uncompressed format, you're going to be okay. Little tiny photos, like they used to print in the 1920s, it would be like 2 inches by 3 inches. 600 DPI isn't high enough resolution. Also, slides and negatives have to be way higher resolution. You also have to have a scanner that can scan negatives and slides. Most scanners will do fine with print quality. You could get a decent size resolution. But I use an Epson Perfection B600. It was about $250. It's not cheap, but it's not $1,000. And it does 35 millimeter slides and negatives. And it does 2 1/4 format. That's a square format. It doesn't do 4 by 5. You need a bigger scanner for that. But most of the time, a historical slide, you will have a scanner. Okay, then just to give you some guidelines on that. Slides, once again, are really important because they're often your only source of color in a black and white world. Okay, next. In addition to photographs, don't eschew other sorts of images. In my books, I like to use not just photographs, which I have access to many, but other sorts of images sort of break things up. It makes it more interesting. So you can use a map. The one at the left, you see Collahatchee there between Fort Lauderdale and Pompano. That's a Dixie Highway map, by the way. Oakland Park, that's our city logo back in the day when our slogan was a best place to live. The Florinata Club, Oakland Park in the 20s was briefly a resort community that aspired to be the Biarritz of America. Woo-hoo. Kind of like Boca was going to be this big fancy resort. And unfortunately, the boom went bust about the time they got started. And we became Boca Park. Storyland Star, that is in our collection. It's a local park. And I digitized that, and I did share a copy with them. Apparently, you could get this, an issue when you went there for a birthday party, and this would be your souvenir. So Roz Miller is the birthday guest of Patty Grady. Patty, if you're out there, here you go. And of course, we have a postcard from one of Oakland Park's best known landmarks, Corky's Hideaway, where the LA Fitness now is at Federal and 38th Street, which allegedly is inspiration for the rather infamous movies of the same name. And from what I hear, it's pretty accurate. Okay, next slide. Now let's talk about publishing a little bit. It's very easy today to do self-publishing, and I'm not going to talk about that. You need other people to talk about that. Online through Amazon or whatever. You can print on demand. You don't have to spend a lot of money to have a very nice product and a limited run. So you don't have to invest in thousands of books to get a quality publication. The problem is these are what we call a vanity press. That means you did it yourself. And distributors and retailers and bookstores such as are left today, certainly historical journals and literary editors aren't going to give you the time of day if you don't have a publisher. And that's why you might want to consider going with it. The one I have the most experience with is Arcadia and History Press. And what they're interested in is, number one, can you write? What quality images do you have access to? And what is your audience? Are there enough people in your community to warrant publishing 1,000 books? Are they going to be able to sell them? Now, the way it works, back in the 80s, before the 80s, if you were the Pompano Historical Society and you wanted to publish a book on your photographs, you'd have to cough up, thousands and thousands of dollars to do so. And it's costs more to print photographs. It costs way more to print color photographs than it does text. Okay, so it was very expensive, so we couldn't do it. But along came Arcadia, and they made it possible for a local historical society or a private collector to publish their small collection and share it with thousands of people. Wonderful, wonderful for the local history business. Now, today, you have the copyrights, but they own the books. In order to publish with Arcadian History Press and probably these other publishers as well, you as an agency or as an individual have to commit to purchasing, pre-purchasing a certain number, 100 books or something like that, before they will go ahead. So you are going to have to come up with some cash in advance, okay? So that's part of the commitment. You don't get any free books. You get books at cost or at the the author's rate. And you can in turn sell them whatever price. You can give them away. You can make extra money. You can sell them. You can undercut History Press Arcadia. But nonetheless, that's how it works. It's still much less expensive than doing 10,000 copies of your own book. Most of these publishers, they do a lot of the heavy hitting with the PR and marketing. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't have your Facebook page and on your website and give lectures locally. That's where you really sell books. But they're helping you out. They're going to go to the big bookstores and stuff like that. Arcadia sold my books at Boca Costco. I did book signing at Costco. Arcadia has my books at Walgreens. It makes me so excited when I walk by. So anyway, so next slide. So I just want to warn you, with History Press and Arcadia anyway, the proposal form is something like 14 pages. And what they are looking for is they want to see if you can write. But they want to see an outline. They want to see if you have thought about your topic and how in depth. And they want to see those outlets. Where will they be able to sell your book? Do you have enough outlets in your community or beyond? Are you willing to give talks on your book? Do you have a Facebook page? Do you have a website? All that sort of question. So that's what it is. And I just included a couple so you see how much text I had to put into it. So it's going to take a little bit of work. But that's all right. You have a real publish. Next slide. So that really concludes my talk. And I hope you've enjoyed it, maybe learned a few points that you can share. And I want to encourage all of you to take on a task of local history. It could be an article. It could be for the Historical Society newsletter. It could be for the Pelican. It could be for the Fort Lauderdale News or some kind of history journal. Or it could be a book, particularly if you have images and so on. I strongly believe that sharing local history is a key to building a sense of community. Whether you're a newcomer or an old timer or an in-between, you can learn something, and it all binds us. We've got to know where we've been to know where we're going. And that's my talk. Thank you.